Welcome, everyone, to our next program of Extraordinary Women. Everyone here is in for a treat. Those of you that are new to the program are in for a real treat, and those of you that are coming back know what you're in for. Dr. Anna Urowitz Freudenstein is going to talk with us. Today's topic is Deborah and Yael, Biblical Military Heroes. So I ask you to put any questions you have in the Q&A, and Anna is going to stop partway through, and we'll give her the questions and she will answer them. So Anna, I turn it over to you.
Okay, hi everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the introduction. I think I forgot to explain last time the idea here of, I've taught on Zoom for a few months now. This is a different experience for me what I'm having with you guys, in that it's something called a webinar, in that I don't get to see any of your faces as I'm teaching. So it's a little bit of a challenge for me that way, in terms of I don't get to see people's reactions. So I very much look forward to hearing questions midway through, as Carol said, and then also reserve time at the end for questions. So that will help with the connection between us a little bit. The other connection between us that I so miss is that, having grown up in Toronto and lived here most of my life, I'm assuming that maybe I know some of you, and I'm missing out on that kind of very cool Jewish geography that sometimes happens at the beginning and end of classes. So with those heartfelt emotions, we'll begin. Today's topic is focused on two particular women who are somewhat unusual, and they're found in a very unusual book in the Tanakh. So you might have heard some of these stories before, and if you do, it'll be a review for you, but hopefully you'll learn new things and think new ideas about these women and these topics, because I'll be able to put some of them into a larger rabbinic as well as historic context for you, as well as putting things through a little bit through of a feminist philosophical lens as well. So, one other thing I wanted to mention, I believe our formal title, actually, I'm going to go ahead and share the screen so that we can see it together. Here we go. So we have here two women, Deborah and Yael, biblical military heroines. I just want to talk a little bit about my language and some of the words we'll be using so that you don't get confused. First of all, devorah is sometimes spelled Deborah. In Hebrew, it's devorah. For me, it rolls off my tongue that way more easily. So that's the way I will be saying it. I hope you guys are seeing this, because it's a little bit of a different view for me than I usually see it. There we go. I'm sorry. So, sorry, Deborah, same person. Similarly, I'm pronouncing the name Yael the way it is in Hebrew, the way it is in the Tanakh. Often in English, it's spelled with a J. I don't know how you pronounce it then. Jael, I'm not sure, but anyway, the Hebrew pronunciation is Yael. Not similarly, but interesting in terms of language and how it works. And we'll be paying special attention today to gendered language. But we have the word in English, heroines, although sometimes I just feel like heroes rolls off the tongue a little bit easier. And similarly, prophetesses or prophetess, we'll see that today. You'll hear me go back and forth between that and prophet. Of course, I mean no disrespect to prophetesses. It just, I think that prophet can pretty much apply to both male and female. So I'll probably stick with prophet. Okay, so hopefully that won't cause any confusion for you. Let's get started. These are two particular women, as we're going to see. They both are found in the book of Judges. I want to talk about that a little bit, but our first main concentration is on the woman Deborah. Oh, also in terms of context, In terms of our liturgical calendar, just to keep in mind, we've recently started the book of Shemot of Exodus in the regular weekly Torah readings on Shabbat and during the week. And we're in the midst of telling now the story for this coming Shabbat, the end of the story of the 10 plagues and coming out of Egypt. The following week it continues, and it's called Shabbat Shirah because it is the week where it is the song of the Israelites that they sing after successfully crossing the Red Sea. The Haftorah, the prophetic reading for that week, not this Shabbat, but the following one, is another song. This one, the song of Deborah, the same woman that we are studying about today. So we will talk a little bit about her song moving forward. All right. Now, speaking of context and historical context, today we are moving outside of, well, actually last time we moved outside of the Torah also into more prophetic texts. But I thought today history might be a little bit important for us. So in order to demonstrate that for you, I know history isn't everyone's most favorite thing in the world or strong point. I thought I would show it to you on this fabulous timeline. I did not make this timeline. It's available on the web. And I think it was made by someone who's not necessarily a historian, but he's a person who's like a computer developer, I think, has made a one-page timeline of Jewish history. Now, you might think that's a little bit weird because it means you have to use this teeny tiny writing to cram everything in. But the wonderful thing is you can see it all in front of you, all in one go. And then you can scroll over it. By the way, you should be writing down this website right now. Oh my, I've just blocked it. odyeda.com. So this gives you the look of all of Jewish history all in one go. And then you can look at it and scroll over some things or click on some things, and it makes them bigger. So what I wanted to show you today, as you see, as I'm doing right now, is this time period of the judges. That's what we're talking about today. So the patriarchs, for instance, is Tamar and Judah would have been, who we talked about last week, is the time period of the patriarchs. Today we'll also be talking about prophets. People are more familiar with that, I think. But in between the time period of the patriarchs and all of that, those stories, including the whole time in Egypt and in the desert and coming into the land of Israel. After that is the judges, which is the time period of the conquering of the land of Israel. And then kings and prophets is pretty much when the people have been established in Israel, the Jewish people. So I just wanted you to have a sense of that and also access to this in case you were ever interested in it on your own. So we are talking today about the time period of the judges, okay? And now on to the next slide. Okay, we'll move to the next slide this way. Here we go. Here's the story of Deborah. In this time period of the judges, there isn't one ruler in Israel. There are sequential rulers that rule for a relatively short amount of time before they die or are conquered, and then we move on to the next ruler. So we start in chapter 4 of this book, the book of Judges, which comes just after the book of Joshua, which comes just after the 5 books of Moses. And we have the previous ruler's name was Ehud, as we see here. He is now dead. And there is now a military situation going on. And the Lord surrendered them to King Yavin or Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. His army commander was Sisera. We're going to see that name again, whose base was in this place that I don't know how to pronounce in English. So basically we have the Israelites, who in this time, it's before the time of kings. They are being led by judges and by prophets, who we'll see in a minute. And in this case, we haven't been introduced to our prophet yet or our judge, but we know that there's a military crisis at this point. The Canaanites, who are the enemy, the bad guys, are looking to attack the Israelites. And so the Israelites were scared and they called out to God because this king had a very fierce army, 900 iron chariots, and he had been oppressing Israel ruthlessly for 20 years. Okay, so we need someone to save the day. Who are we going to have to save the day? In this case, we're going to have Deborah. So we need to learn about Deborah. That's what we're going to spend the next few minutes doing. And then we're going to see how she saves the day. But let's learn about her first. The two main verses that tell us so much, they're two verses and they're packed full with information, are here highlighted in front of you. I want to look at them piece by piece, take them apart, unpack them, as they say. And so in order to do that, we're going to look at the next slide. Oh, I've just shared a picture with you today, though. Here is a picture of Deborah by Marc Chagall. All right, here we go. Here are the two verses that I was mentioning before. Hebrew speakers will especially appreciate. Non-Hebrew speakers, don't worry, I will take you through it. I think even non-Hebrew speakers, though, recognize that Hebrew, much like French and other languages, is a gendered language. So that you have nouns that have feminine endings, you have verbs that have feminine endings, not so much like we have in English. So we have here Deborah's femaleness really being emphasized, not only because she is actually called a woman, but also because, of course, we have feminine forms of nouns and verbs being used throughout, which, quite frankly, we don't see that often in the Bible. So my English translation of this first verse is Deborah. Great, we have her name. Now we have an unusual phrase, woman of Lapidote. We're going to learn a lot more about that moving on. She was a woman prophetess. Now, prophetess, standalone in Hebrew, was feminine. You don't need the word woman here, but the word woman or Isha appears. So it's almost like reinforcing the idea that she's a woman. Not only is she a woman prophetess, but she judged Israel at that time. Now, we might begin to wonder, what does the word judging mean here? Is it something technical? Is it something official? Remember, the name of our book is called the Book of Judges, or Shoftim. And also the names of other leaders throughout the book are also given the title of Shofet. Every single other one of them is male. She is the only female. So you might think we don't know from this verse alone that it's a technical term, but if we go and look at the second verse, we learn immediately that it's quite technical. We learn the place where she used to sit to do her work under the palm of Deborah that got named for her. Then we have the location of where it is. And then it says here, and the Israelites would come to her for judgments. The word there, mishpat. So there are technical things that she is taking care of here. She is a judge. She is giving official judgments here. So what we have is really a little bit of American government on my brain, perhaps, but we have here the judiciary branch in one person tied in with the leadership, we'll see in a moment, even military leadership, tied in with religious leadership, all packed into this very one special person. So she was a prophetess and she was a judge. She was also this thing called woman of Lapidote. We'll learn more about that as we go along. First, though, we do need to emphasize a little bit about this idea of prophetesses. I'm not sure everyone is familiar with the idea that we do have prophetesses in our Jewish tradition. In fact, they're listed for us here in a tractate of the Talmud, where the rabbis actually list 7 of them. Now, there are others that could argue that there might be a few others as well, but for now, in the interest of time, we will stick with these 7. If you see on the slide, I'm sure you recognize some of these names. The ones that I have given to you in the yellow highlights are ones that actually are given the title Nevi'ah, prophetess, in the Bible itself. The other ones act in such a way that the rabbis assume they are prophetesses. And sometimes it's a little bit of a stretch for them to actually prove it. And they go on for the next few pages here in the Talmud to try to explain how each of these are considered prophetesses, even if they aren't labeled as such in the Bible. So that would be a fascinating topic for another class. But of course, Deborah falls into this category. Now I've introduced her to you, I think I need to tell you more about her story. As we know from our title, she's a military heroine. And as you know from the beginning, that we started to explain that she is a leader in a time when there's a military crisis. So she is not the only leader at the time. There is also another leader named Barak, who is the head of the army. He's the military leader at that time. And she called him. She's the prophetess. She has gotten information directly from God in the tradition. And that information is the Lord God of Israel has commanded. Okay, she's now speaking for God as the prophetess. Go march up to Mount Tabor and take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zvulun, those tribes who are going to fight with him. And then God, again, Deborah speaking for God, says, I will draw Sisera. We heard that name before. That's the bad guy's army commander, with his chariots and troops towards you until this point, Wadi Kishon, and then the battle or whatever will happen, and I will deliver him into your hands. So basically, you're going to have a military, meet up with the enemy, and then you will be successful. The Israelites will be successful. Barak, even though he's the military leader, says to her, well, no, I will only go if you go with me. He's not going alone. Okay, this is the head of the army, and he's not going without Deborah. Very well, I will go with you, she answered. Not necessarily thinking about, us, we think about prophets, perhaps as men, first of all, men of peace, not necessarily of war. We don't necessarily think of women as going to war, and yet she jumps at the opportunity. She recognizes that this is essential for this battle to happen in this way, and says, however, there will be no glory for you in the course you are taking, and that you asked me to come with you, or that you doubted and needed me to come with you. For then the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. Okay, she's going to be there. How is Sisera, the enemy, the head of the enemy army, going to be conquered? There's a prophecy here. She's a prophet after all. That'll be by the hands of a woman. Now, Deborah went up with Barak to Kadesh, and they had the battle. Oh, here's another painting for you, also by Marc Chagall, very different than the stained glass we saw before. Deborah sitting under her palm tree. Now, we're about to learn more about the battle, but before the battle, as I put here in italics, there's a weird little intro about a new character to our story, Heber, the Canaanites, okay, Heber HaKeni in Hebrew. We just get introduced to him here. I'm going to leave him aside from now, and we're going to talk about him more when we get to Yael, actually, our second woman. So anyway, we're in the middle of the battle, Sisera and all of his chariots, they're ready to go, they're ready to fight. And Deborah said to Barak, up, this is the day on which the Lord will deliver Sisera into your hands. Don't worry, the Lord is marching before you. This is a religious war that you're fighting. God is protecting you. And in fact, that is what happened. And at the end here, they conquer the enemy and the Lord threw Sisera and his chariots into a panic before the onslaught of Barak, and that's why they were able to be successful. Sisera leapt from his chariot and fled on foot. We're going to hear from him again. But at this point, though, all the other soldiers were killed. So the battle was successful. Now, that is the end of Deborah's story from chapter 4. As I mentioned, chapter 5 is something very different. It's a poetic version of what just happened before in the form of a song or a poem. In Hebrew, it's the same word, the word shir. And this is the one that is read as part of the Haftorah, the prophetic readings on Shabbat Shirah, that will be happening not this Shabbat, but next Shabbat. And it kind of parallels the song that, the Song of the Sea that Moses and Miriam sing in gratitude to God, having come through the Reed Sea on dry land, and then Pharaoh and the Egyptian army are then drowned. Here we have Deborah and Barak singing a song, thanking God also in gratitude for having delivered them from this particular other different type of military attack. So it's a very poetic language, actually somewhat difficult to understand. I just had some of it here. I just kind of cut and pasted a few of the verses here so that you would get a sense of it. You can take a look at it, just trying to be mindful of the time. What I want you to see in particular is this kind of poetic phraseology here that we're going to talk about more in a minute. Oh, Devorah. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. O Deborah arose, O mother in Israel. So we had a number of different ways of describing her before. Remember, prophetess and judge, etc. Now we have a different way of describing her, mother in Israel. And we're going to have to think about what that means. In fact, we're going to do that right now. I see it's already 2:25, but I'd like to get through this little bit first, and then I'll take any questions if there are any. There might not be any, but there might be some that would arise from this. I want to learn more about Deborah by emphasizing her names and titles. Like I was kind of set the stage for this before. So some of this will be familiar, the titles, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into them. The first one is this term woman of Lapidote. In Hebrew, it's Eshet Lapidote. Truthfully, it really could be translated as wife of Lapidote, or woman of torches. The word lapid is, so woman of torches, or wife. Lapidote comes where we would normally expect a husband's name, so-and-so the wife of so-and-so, which would be very standard in the Bible. Oh no, my internet is unstable. I hope that you guys can hear me. But it's not standard at all, because the name Lapidote is not a standard name for a man. In fact, it sounds almost like a feminine form of a noun. And also it's missing this standard son of. As you know, in Hebrew, we call your name by your name, and then you're the son of your father's name. And it doesn't look like that. So it raises a lot of question marks. If we leave it though with wife of Lapidote, assuming Lapidote is just an unusual name, it has an advantage to us because it can emphasize that a prophet can be married. You might think, like in some traditions, not Jewish, but in other traditions, that maybe a prophet needs to be an ascetic or not married. That would not be true. The other thing that we could learn from it about women is that a married woman could have a role in addition to being a wife. That you could be a married woman and even a prophetess, assuming that she is a wife. However, if you go with the translation of the term woman of torches, like a kind of a fiery woman, it also fits the image of Deborah because she can be seen as a torch that lights the fire. The word Barak, the name of that Jewish general, the Israelite general, means lightning. So there's a lot of fieriness going on there, which I would think would be important if you're about to lead your people into battle. Let's talk about the term, the idea about a female prophet who's involved in battle. As I mentioned before, in my mind at least, I'd like to think of prophets as people of peace, usually as men of peace. Here we have a female prophet and she's involved in war. So the interesting thing is we know from other archaeological evidence and epigraphic evidence that in the ancient Near East, in ancient Assyria, non-Jewish, they had prophetesses as well. They had female prophetesses. So Perhaps it comes out of that milieu. And also, we know that in the ancient Near East, that the presence of women was used to inspire the troops and even taunt the enemy, an interesting role in war. So if we think about it this way, perhaps it normalizes Barak's request to Deborah for her to actually go into war with him. Now we have this poetic phrase, mother in Israel. Interesting to think about, because as far as we know from the biblical record, Deborah did not have biological children of her own. So we see her here as a leader who's taking care of her people. Perhaps it's that the term mother in Israel is emphasizing. Not so sure. I'd like to think about the idea of mother as nurturer, but we're going to think about it more when we get to Yael. Finally, just want to talk about her name a little bit here, Devorah. So it could be seen as an anagram of the term she spoke, Deborah, he Deborah, like lidaber means to speak. So maybe it has to do with the idea of speaking how prophets speak. But also we can't kind of shy away from the idea that Devorah, even in modern Hebrew again, means a bee, like a buzzing bee. So there are a lot of these. One modern commentary I saw likes to emphasize the fact that perhaps she's like the queen bee who raises up the swarm for battle, sending out the drones to protect the hive and conquer new territory. I really like that imagery. Unfortunately, the more common way of understanding the term devorah as a bee, or in this case, a wasp or a hornet, is emphasized in the Talmud, in the tractate Megillah. And there's a discussion about the idea of haughtiness, of being like too full of yourself. And there, Rav Nachman says haughtiness is not befitting a woman. Proof of this is there are two haughty women whose names were identical to the names of loathsome creatures. One of them is our Devorah, who's called a hornet. So think about not the queen bee aspect, but the stinging aspect, as her name Deborah means hornet. And the other one was Huldah, who you might remember from our list of other prophetesses, was actually on that list, a lesser known female prophet. She was called Huldah, which is a marten. If you don't know what a marten is, I'm not sure I do either. Some translations, though, use the word weasel here. Regardless, it's a rodent, so not a positive type of imagery here. Her name is the same as that creature. So where do we know they're haughty? According to the rabbis, close reading of the text, with regard to Devorah, the hornet, as it is written, and she sent and called Barak, but she herself did not go to him. She was so full of herself that she called for the man, rather than her getting up and going to him. This is their reading of it. And then there's a similar idea with Huldah, where she referred to the king at that time as a man rather than the proper title of the king. So the idea is that because they were seen as misspeaking in this way, not showing proper respect to the men in their lives, they're seen as haughty and not appropriate. And that is emphasized by the negativeness of their names, either the stinging bee or the weaselly rodent. So that is a kind of a more traditional rabbinic approach to this particular name, Devorah, and this not name, but to this particular character of Devorah. Okay, any questions?
Anna, there are a couple of questions.
Okay, so let's go for it.
One is, what is the Jewish definition of prophet or prophetess?
Okay, so that's really interesting. There are entire chapters of, I think actually it's Maimonides spends a long time on that. What I like to see, because when I talk about female prophetesses, we're not talking about Miriam, for instance, in our particular sessions together, but she's called a prophetess, and she doesn't seem to be like a standard prophet that we might think, because we tend to think of the word prophet, I think the way it's used in the English language, as someone who tells the future. And a prophet in the Bible, according to, the Jewish Bible, is someone who can tell the future, but usually they're telling the future in order to teach a lesson. to teach a lesson of to say, if you don't fix your ways, if you don't stop messing up, bad things are going to happen. So, and so therefore, and these are the bad things that could happen if you keep messing up. But similarly, a prophet can also bring hope, can tell the future about how things will be in the future when the Messiah comes or other wonderful things happening. But generally, a prophet in Jewish tradition is someone who speaks for God. So the idea of prophecy does not exist anymore. It was contained to the time period of the written Bible. And so it's someone who is a mouthpiece for God, that they speak for God, and very often given a role of religious leader. And that's why we sometimes see them leading the people in this kind of gratitude prayers.
Okay. There is one more question.
Mhm.
How would a woman have been trained to go to war? And is there evidence of this?
Okay, so what we have here is leadership in war, which I think is very different than fighting in war, although our next hero that we're going to see actually is someone who gets more intimately involved in the violence related to a war. But for devorah, we have someone who's in a leadership role. We have someone who's in an inspirational role, leading the people. I would say not giving like the military tactics or anything like that. That would have been up to devorah, up to Barak, her male counterpart in this way. In terms of women being involved in war, as I mentioned, when I gave the example from the ancient Near Eastern texts, I don't have any of them at my disposal. I actually learned that information from articles I've read from a wonderful scholar who's no longer alive, Dr. Tikva Frymer-Kensky, and she was an expert in the ancient Near East and an expert in the Bible. So she was able to look at those non-Jewish cultures that lived at the same time and do compare and contrast with the biblical ideas to try to understand more about the Bible. So it is from her writings that I learned that idea that there were these in that part of the world, in the ancient Near East, that women were involved in these, I don't want to say cheerleader roles, but like inspirational roles of leadership in terms of egging on or encouraging the troops and then also frightening the enemy. So I would say it's a different, not involvement like with spears and shields, but rather by using their voices or their bodies to inspire and to also inspire for the good and to inflict fear when appropriate.
Okay, just one more before we go on.
No
How
problem.
did Deborah get to be a prophetess, and how was she selected?
Okay, so again, the idea of the prophet is getting information directly from God. We don't know, well, we don't have her story. What I'm telling you about Deborah, is all we know about her. So we only have a little snippet, really, of her story. There are other prophets who we know the first time that God spoke to them. Very often it's in a dream. Usually it's in a dream. In fact, Moses is said to be the only prophet that spoke to God, not quite face to face, but as close to face as humans would be allowed to. So usually it's in some kind of bit of ecstasy, they call it, or even in a nighttime dream that and usually often involved a lot of symbolism and poetry, that a poet would be taught that they're a poet, or not taught, but they'd be told, like, guess what, you're a prophet, and now God is going to have this intimate relationship with you and use you as God's mouthpiece to teach and lead the people. So we do have that from some of the prophets, that kind of part of their story, what that looked like or felt like. For Deborah, we're just told she's a prophet. We're not told that part of the story.
Okay, thank you. And the one last comment was, in other words, she was a motivational speaker, is what. Yeah.
Well, she was a motivational speaker with her words being fed to her rather than on the teleprompter in front of her, but directly from God. So she was a motivational speaker in a different realm, and also, I mean, I'm assuming if she was again, we don't know too much about this role of her as judge in addition to prophetess, but she was basically the legal authority at the time as well. So you have to be very smart to have that role and to know the law and to apply the law to any circumstance that someone brings to you. So she's chosen by God, and she's obviously up for the task, and she's able to accomplish all these other things as well.
Okay, let's part two.
Part two. Sorry, just gonna cough. All right, here we go. Yael, same book we're reading from here. In fact, Yael is really a continuation of Deborah's story, who we will see in a moment. For Yael's story, though, what I've done is gone all the way back to the first chapter of the same book of Judges, is to give a little bit of context there in terms of where she's coming from. And then we skip to chapter 4 that we have been talking about. And then we'll see some of her being discussed in that song of Deborah and Barak that we mentioned before, that poem that's in chapter 5. So someone asked actually very wonderfully, how did Deborah know she was a prophet and where did she come from and everything? And I admitted that we don't really know. She just kind of appears in our stories. As a matter of fact, we don't know where she comes from in terms of, what her father's name was, what her tribe was, or anything else. She has her authority directly from God, and it just stayed for us that way. Yael, who is a woman, we'll learn about in a second. She is not a prophetess. She does something else. She's a military heroine or hero. And so for her, we're actually given a little bit of context in terms of where she comes from. Actually, not her husband, which would not be so unusual in biblical times that we would be learning about her lineage of of a woman through her husband. So we're going to see in a minute that her husband is named Heber the Hakeni. Oh, actually, I told you he was mentioned once I read those italics that we saw before. But first, it's an unusual name that he's identified not really by a tribe, but somehow some other kind of clan or group called the Kenites. This is not the same as the Canaanites. That's with the C in English. It's not Canaan like the land of Israel. It's a smaller tribe than that. So we first encounter this term of Kenite in the book of Judges, back in the first chapter, where we learn that the descendants of the Kenite, who was the father-in-law of Moses. Now, many of you know, I think the father-in-law of Moses, his name was Jethro in English, or Yitro in Hebrew. So the question is, how is the Kenite the father-in-law of Moses? And actually, it is this verse, as well as many midrashim, that help us with that, in that even though Yitro is his name as far as we know it, he has actually other names as well. One of them is Hovav, one of them is Hakeni. And so here we have that this term Kenite is associated with the father-in-law of Moses. So that's a pretty cool yechus to have, a pretty cool lineage to have. And we learn here where they are settling in the land of Israel, once the land has started to be conquered by Joshua and after him, and they're settling in after coming through the desert, after coming out of Egypt. So that we hear about him there. And then in chapter 4, we hear about him again in the middle of that military scene. It gets interrupted to just let us know that this Heber the Keni separated from the other Kenites. We don't know if that's positive or negative or neutral, but that he now is being announced that he's living somewhere. And we're going to see that tent where he pitched his tent is going to come in very important in a moment. All right, so we've learned a little bit about this guy, Heber Hakeni. Now, more important though, is we're going to learn about his wife, and his wife's name is Yael. So Now we move on to chapter 17. This really picks up where we left off before about Deborah. And we see here that after all the soldiers had been killed, remember we said Sisera ran away. He wasn't killed. The commander jumped ship, and not a ship, but jumped his army and escaped. So Sisera, I guess in English, I'm pronouncing it the Hebrew way, the Canaanite army commander, meanwhile had fled on foot. Where did he go? To the tent of Yael. Remember we saw a tent here before? This is the tent of Yael. Who's Yael? The wife of Heber the Hakeni. I'm just going to say it in Hebrew. He's not at home though. She is alone. For why did he run to there? Because there was a friendship between King Yavin of Hatzor, and the family of Heber the Canaanite. The Kenites, excuse me. So who are these people? Just as a reminder, this King Yavin is Sisera's boss. He's the head of the Canaanites who Deborah and Barak are fighting against. So these are the bad guys. And it seems like the family of Heber the Kenai has some kind of friendship, has a friendship with him. So he's running from his enemies. Sisera is running from his enemies. He's looking for a friend and ally. And so he runs to Yael's tent. Don't ask me how he knows how she was living there, whatever, but somehow he knows that his king's ally is there. Yael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come in, my lord, come in here. Do not be afraid." She's treating him with quite a bit of respect. She sees he's running away. She probably sees he's very frantic. So he entered her tent and she covered him with a blanket. He said to her, "Please give me some water. I'm thirsty." He's just been running from an enemy army. So she opened a skin of milk. So skin is like a canteen, an ancient form of a canteen, and gave him to drink. He asks for water, but she gives him milk. And she covered him up again. He's, exhausted from running and from fighting and whatever. And now she's letting him rest. He said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent. If anyone comes and asks if there's anybody here, say no." He is reinforcing to her that he's in running, he's in hiding. He sees her as a political ally. But if we remember, here's what her husband might be friends with his boss, with the bad guy's boss. But there's also a connection to the Jewish people through this concept that they are descendants of the father-in-law of Moses. Okay, so keep that in mind, kind of a dual alliance, perhaps. So seems like she's neutral, but she also potentially has these dual alliances. Of course, Sisera doesn't realize that. Then Yael, wife of Heber, took a tent pin and grasped the mallet. When he was fast asleep from exhaustion, she approached him stealthily and drove the pin through his temple till it went down to the ground. He was sleeping on his side, and thus he died. So she kills him while he's sleeping in a rather gruesome way, quite intentionally. Okay. And how do we know it's quite intentionally? That she knows she's killed the general, the commander of the bad guys, because now Barak appeared in pursuit of Sisera. They've killed everyone else. Now they're looking for the guy in charge. Yael went out to greet him and said, "Come, I will show you the man you are looking for." She knows she had the general. She knows that now if she is an ally of the Jewish people, that she takes it upon herself to actually kill him. He went inside with her, and there Sisera was lying dead with the pin in his temple. On that day, God subdued King Yavin of Canaan before the Israelites. Interesting kind of final sentence here to our story, in that it kind of puts God back into the story to show us that this war is something that is all part of God's plan. Now there are many paintings that depict this gruesome killing, political assassination, if you'd like to refer to it that way. This one in particular is done by a female painter of Italian painter of the 1600s. All right. Now, we learn a little bit more about her when her story is retold in that poetic form. As I said, chapter 5 is a song or poem where the whole story gets told again as part of this prayer of gratitude to God. And certain things we've learned about Deborah there. Remember, we saw her referred to there as a mother in Israel. Here, we're also going to learn a little bit more about Yael. I took out the verses that for us that apply to Yael. I like here that in the beginning, or part of this verse says, in the days of Yael. Sounds like they're really, counting the time by her. She seems like a regular woman, but she's really risen to the occasion, and the time gets known by her name, at least in this poetic form. She's called blessed of women by, most blessed of women be Yael, wife of Kenai, most blessed of women intense. This is seen as a very positive thing she did. This is interesting also. He asked for water and she offered milk. Okay, so we'll end up talking about this again in 2 weeks. We're talking about Judith. If you know that story at all, there's some similarities. We'll have to talk about this again. But in this particular story, he asked for water. He's very thirsty. He's very desperate. She offered milk. You might think, isn't that lovely? She's giving him more than he asks for. It's also very interesting because milk, I think of being nurturing, something coming from a woman, a mother's milk. Seems like that she's comforting him. But also, the idea of giving someone milk, a baby, or even warm milk for an adult is often something that it puts someone to sleep, which she needed him to sleep because I don't think she'd be able to overpower him to kill him if he was awake. So it's interesting there what we can learn about from the idea of offering milk in this particular case. And then the actual, the killing is described further here. I don't know if we have time. I think I'm going to skip this for now. It's a very short video. And you know what? I'm going to leave this for when this is a little teaser to come back to see us. I believe it's in 2 weeks. We're going to talk about the book of Judith, which is a non-biblical Jewish book. And we're going to have to remember some of our story of Deborah and Yael in order to better understand it. So I'll share this little film note with you then. Okay, so I'm going to skip it now in the interest of time. Just because I want to talk to you a little bit about this idea of Yael being Jewish or not. We talked quite a bit, about Deborah's identity and her characteristics as a prophetess, as a woman of Lapidote, of torches, as a queen bee, or as a hornet, as a judge, all those things. Let's see what more we can learn about Yael. We don't know very much about her, but the idea about was she Jewish or not, I think is interesting if we're looking for female heroines in the Bible, heroes, to help ourselves, to teach our daughters, to teach our sons about. Could we have heroes in the Bible that aren't Jewish? It's an interesting thing to think about. But in this particular case, we actually have different traditions as to whether she was Jewish or not. Truth is, we don't know anything about her, but at least we know a little bit more about her husband. So we're going to assume that in those days, if the husband was considered Israelite, then she would as well. So in this particular case, we have identified her husband by his name. We said that he's a descendant of Jethro. He somehow is connected to the father-in-law of Moses. So somehow an ally of the Jewish people, but we've also learned that he's a friend of the non-Jewish enemy king as well. So we see that kind of dual loyalty they were talking about before. So the question is, though, was he just somehow related to someone who is connected to the Jewish people, or is he actually Jewish himself? And I don't have an answer for us actually, because in the rabbinic tradition, both those ideas exist about Yitro. Remember, I told you he had a lot of names: Chovav, Kenai, Yeter, Yitro. He's got a lot of different names. The name Chovav, though, has to do with the idea of chiba, or love. And many rabbis have interpreted that, our ancient rabbis, to understand that he had a love of Torah. And so according to the Talmud and other sources, that he actually converted to Judaism. So if the father-in-law, Yitro, of Moses, converted to Judaism, then presumably his descendants would be Jewish as well. So it's an interesting other kind of twist to put into the Yael story in terms of trying to understand her rationale, her loyalties. We don't know. There's a lot of question marks, but I thought at least I would present to you some of the different options. Now, in terms of whether she actually was Israelite or not, whether she was or not, I wanted to share with you this midrash that talks about that God was with her when she performed this dastardly deed of this very gruesome killing. And God was watching out for her. This particular midrash talks about actually something else that we haven't talked about, which is interesting, is that she was alone with a man in the tent. And for biblical times, and even for rabbinic, that would make it quite questionable in terms of, was there something inappropriate sexual going on there? Was she, did she have some kind of sexual interaction, either that she consensual or non-consensual, with Sisera before she actually killed him? And this midrash comes to show us that, according to this tradition, she did not. That even though she was actually in another piece in the Talmud that talks about the fact that she's in fact very beautiful and desirable, it says here that God was with her and that because of that she escaped sexual sin. It's listed with a list of 3 other people who were in similar situations. The first one you're probably familiar with and has to do with Joseph when he is being seduced by the wife of Potiphar. Yael is the one that we're emphasizing here. And how do we know that God was with Yael all the time and therefore she was protected in terms of inappropriate sexual advances? Because of the word here, smicha. In modern Hebrew, I'm pretty sure the word smicha means blanket and something that's put on something else. Pretty standard. But according to our ancient rabbis, they had a little bit of a question as to what that word meant, because apparently it is the only time that word appears in the entire Tanakh. And so when that happens, sometimes there's a question as to what the word actually means. So the different opinions that are shared here is that it means a shawl. Okay, that's pretty much the same as a blanket. Or a wash basin. Perhaps that's something that she turned over and kind of captured him with, that put something heavy on top of him to contain him. But there's another rabbi, Reish Lakish, that says, no, that it means something else. That the word smicha, and you need to see the Hebrew letters here, that if you split the word Hebrew letters, the Hebrew word in half, you can have 2 little words that are put smushed together to make the same letters, different vowels though, and different pronunciation. So if you switch it to be shmiko instead of smicha, which would make sense in ancient Hebrew, which didn't have the vowels in it, it means my name is there, which means that God's name was present in the tent with her as part of being put on Sisera's body, and that name of God protects and testifies that everything was kosher in terms of any kind of sexual interaction, that none happened, and there was nothing untoward about their interaction until, of course, she killed him, which in fact was not untoward, in fact was part of God's plan. So we're just going to leave it here. Wanted you to think about some of these ways of characterizing these women, because I think a lot of us want to learn these stories in order to just learn more Torah, which is amazing. But sometimes we want to learn lessons. We want to gain inspiration, perhaps for ourselves or for other family members or students. And so there's a lot of different kind of titles that we could attach to these women. I think the Yael one is a little bit more, there's question marks involved, depending on how you look at things, from which side of the coin you look at it. Devorah, though, which I loved about it, is that Deborah is hyphenated. She's super hyphenated. I've got this long name, Urowitz, Freudenstein, hyphenated. But Deborah beats me because she is hyphenated with all of these amazing titles that she had. I left out that women of Lapidote part because I don't even know what that means. But the idea that she is a prophet and a judge and a military leader and a prayer leader and a mother in Israel, I think it's pretty fabulous. Okay, we will leave it there. Any questions?
Yes, we have a couple.
Okay.
One is, does the Hebrew word for ordination, smicha, have a different spelling?
No, it is the same spelling. Spelling. Excuse me. I've been talking a long time. Smicha for ordination, the official language, the official definition is really the laying on of hands, because originally, all the way back to the Bible, is that the idea of leadership that is given via the role of rabbinic leadership that is given, it used to be, and still is to a certain extent, an idea that is passed down from teacher or teachers nowadays, but in the olden days it was teacher, from teacher to student, after the student had successfully passed whatever kind of learning or test they needed to do. And so the idea is that there was actually a physical laying on of hands. I don't know if it's the shoulders or the heads or whatever, that would be a symbol, a physical symbolism of the passing on of the knowledge from one generation to the next. And that is the laying on of hands, just like the covering of a blanket. So it is from the same root, same Hebrew root.
Thank you. Anna, will you stop sharing your screen right now so that we can go to full screen?
Sure. Full screen. There we go. Yes.
Okay, great. And one other question. It was just a little earlier on.
No
Why
problem.
the use of the word subdue? It was in the previous statement. I can give you the time. It was 2:48, if that helps where you were.
Did I use that word, or it was in the text?
I think it was in the text. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you when it came in.
Trying to, were we talking about the war then? I don't know. Does anyone, whoever wrote that, if you write into the chat again and give me the context, and I'll try to help you. But it might have had to do with the poetic language. Now I don't remember, but the actual battle is described one way in chapter 4, and then in chapter 5, it's actually described in much lengthier way in poetic terms. I only gave us little snippets of it. So there is a chance it didn't make complete sense. I only wanted to give you a feel for what it was like, but you're welcome to open up your Bibles, check out Book of Judges, chapter 5, and read the lengthy poem on your own and find out the different stages of battle there.
And someone else has a wonderful idea. Their suggestion is, what about writing a movie about these two women? And I have to say, while I was watching or listening to you, my thought was, how about a Netflix one? This would be great. We could just keep going with it.
When my kids were little, we said it would be really fun to have, when my daughter was young, all the Disney stuff. They said, why aren't there Jewish Disney princesses where we could emphasize these women, for children or otherwise in movies or books, that they could emphasize these traits rather than just like, being pretty or wanting to get the prince or whatever, like in some of the old-fashioned Disney princesses. And we could have these biblical Jewish princesses and emphasize other aspects about them, but we never did it.
Okay, but there's still time.
I guess there's still time.
Okay. That's all the questions for now. Thank you so much. It's wonderful. I sure wish history had been this interesting when I was in school. I think I would have done, at least I would have listened a lot more. And I welcome everybody back next Wednesday, same time, February 3rd. And the topic is Midrashic Biblical Women.
So in case you don't know what that is, I just remind you, these are women that are only hinted at in the Bible, but then our rabbinic midrashim or commentaries expand on them more. So we will see some of those expansions of women that you might not have ever heard about, and we will study that together.
Are we closing? Because I see that there are a couple of more questions. Do we have time, or should I?
I'm okay. After Anna said okay, we'll go for it.
One of the questions is the name of the website, Read the Jewish History. Please spell. it
Okay,
out?
so that was, oh goodness. I think it's so cool to play around on
I
it.
think I
It's
have it, Anna. It's
O-D, I think,
ODYEDA.
one second, I'm just putting it to my phone to see if that's the right,
Okay.
no, that's not it. All right, do you have it, Carol?
Yes, it's ODYEDA.com. And then slash English, I guess it
Yeah,
is.
I don't think you need that part,
No.
but play
Okay.
around on it, click on different things. It's terrific.
Right. And the person who asked the question about subdue says it's at the end of the story of Yael in reference to the king.
Oh, in reference to the king. So the idea is the
Mhm.
king himself was not part of the battle. He sent out his commander, Sisera, and his very powerful army with all the iron chariots and everything. So the idea is, I guess that meant that even though the king sitting off wherever he was in his palace was probably still alive, but because his entire army had been killed, that the whole threat from the enemy, from that king, had been subdued. So while that kingdom still existed, the threat of them to the Israelites had been subdued because of their success in this war.
Thank you. And I think I led people wrong. I gave the wrong date, as I have been known to do.
Oh.
Next week is not February 3rd. Next week is January 28th, but that is the title we're doing.
Right.
So,
just keep coming back on Wednesdays.
Another one on February 3rd. So
just keep
Anna,
coming back on Wednesdays.
You
We're
bet.
here.
Thank you so much. As just wonderful. And we thank you. Have a good week. Everybody have a good week, and we'll see everybody next week on January 28th. Thanks.
See you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.